I appreciate you watching me as we make history on Rostos Realities. Let's go. First person of color vice president? Not hardly. As you can see from the display on screen, the title is The Conflicted Legacy of the First Vice President of Color. As it relates to the current Vice President of Color. Thing is, and the key word, the key term in this title is conflicted. The current Vice President ran under the guise of a black woman. Even though her history points out some Asian and or some Indian. And the masses drank the Kool-Aid, especially the ones who look like her. The ones who are more involved in symbolisms than actual tangibles, something that will serve all of Black America, both male and female. While the election of Kamala Harris to vice president is historic, she isn't the first person of color to hold the position. The first was actually Charles Curtis, who took office nearly a century ago. What I'm noticing more and more is that even people of color do not want to be associated with black. They'll use every other ethnic background other than black. Curtis was a member of the KAW Nation who served as Herbert Hoover's vice president from 1929 to 1933, and he has a complicated history legacy. Curtis supported women's voting rights, child labor laws, and the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. At the same time, he promoted assimilationist policies that harmed many Native Americans. One of the most significant impacts on U.S. policy is the Curtis Act of 1898, which weakened Native governments and helped break up indigenous reservations. Curtis was born in Topeka in 1860, 1 year before the Kansas Territory became the 34th state. Around age 3, his mother died and his father joined the Union Army to fight in the Civil War. He lived at various times with his non-native paternal grandparents and his native maternal grandparents, Louis and Julie Pappan Gonville, who lived in KAW reservations in Kansas. As a young boy, he became known for winning races. Around 1873, when Louis and Julie were moving with KAW Nation to the Indian Territory in the current state of Oklahoma, Curtis planned to go with them, but his grandmother dissuaded him from joining them. His grandmother basically just says, "You're bound for more important things," says Kent Blansett, a professor of indigenous studies and history at the University of Kansas, who is a Cherokee Creek, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Potawatomi descendant from the Blanket, Panther, and Smith families. Blansett notes that Curtis' grandmother wasn't telling Curtis to turn away from his people, but to help his people by taking another path. Curtis followed his grandmother's advice and stayed in Topeka, becoming a lawyer and a politician. His native heritage, something white politicians and journalists often referred to disparagingly, was public knowledge during his entire political career. In 1884, he won an elected seat as the Shawnee County Attorney. 8 years later, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives as a Republican. The Curtis Act built on the Dawes Act. It was in the House that Curtis introduced an act for the protection of the people of Indian Territory, commonly known as the Curtis Act, of 1898. This act built on the Dawes Act of 1887, which had introduced the policy of allotment. Under this policy, the U.S. government forcibly broke up Native American reservations, where land and resources were communally shared, into privately held properties. Native people who couldn't afford to maintain their allotments lost them, allowing white Americans to buy the land and move into what was once a reservation. Where have we heard that one before? The Curtis Act forced allotments onto the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, known to white Americans as the 5 civilized tribes, who had been exempt from the Dawes Act. This allowed white Americans to take over more of the 5 nations' territory, setting the stage for the incorporation of Oklahoma onto the U.S. as a state. The act also called for the dissolution of native governments, asserting the U.S. government's sovereignty over theirs. The Curtis Act was something that caused irrevocable damage, Blancett said. Even years later, Curtis, who would do a radio show with the famous Cherokee Will Rogers in the 1930s, and Will got booed for having Curtis on. Because in Oklahoma, Cherokees especially couldn't stand what the Curtis Act did to the Cherokee Nation. Yeah, there's a feeling of deja vu overcoming me right now, and only time will tell if my intuition is correct. We shall all see. So why had Curtis, one of the first Native congressmen, sponsored the act in the first place? Colonization led him to believe that assimilation and the acculturation was inevitable for Native peoples, Blancett said. It's kind of impressed upon him that our traditions were something that could possibly be holding us back from full citizenship, and this was a very popular sentiment at the time, though. See, this is part of these Caspers believing that they know what's good for everybody, and they don't know shit, not a fucking thing, but how to tear up shit, tear up other people's heritages, and then claim some of it for themselves. Fuck out of here.